The night before the hanging came quietly, as if even the world itself wished to look away, and Jonah Cole, the most feared outlaw the territory had ever named, sat alone beneath the unfinished gallows with his wrists free for the first time in years, granted this small mercy by a tired sheriff who believed no man should meet death without first meeting himself, and the wind moved slowly through the wooden beams above Jonah's head, making them creak like old bones, whispering stories of all the men who would follow after him. Yet Jonah did not look at the rope, did not curse his fate, did not pray aloud, because his mind was far away, drifting backward through time to a life that no one ever wrote songs about, a life before blood stained his hands and fear followed his name, and as the moon rose pale and thin, he finally spoke, not to the guard sleeping nearby, not to God, but to the empty night that had watched him become a monster, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of every mile he had ridden, every door he had kicked in, every life he had frightened, and he confessed that the truth was never simple, that the legend of Jonah Cole was built on a lie, because once, long before the bounties and the bullets, he had been a gentle man who loved quietly and deeply, a man who believed in stopping rather than taking, in protecting rather than ruling, and it was love that ruined him, though no one ever guessed it. Not the papers, not the townsfolk who spat at his shadow, not the men who hunted him like an animal, because the woman who changed everything had never been named in his crimes, her name Clara Whitfield, spoken now only to the wind, and Jonah told how he met her near a river that glowed gold at sunset, how she laughed softly as if afraid to take up too much space in the world, how she believed people could be saved if someone simply stayed, and how he stayed longer than he should have, laying down his gun, working honest days beside her father, dreaming foolish dreams of a small home and a quiet life, dreams that felt so real they terrified him, and it was that fear, he admitted, that planted the first seed of darkness, because when men from his old gang came looking, bringing trouble like a storm, Jonah chose the gun instead of the truth, violence instead of trust, thinking he could protect Clara by becoming something worse, something she would never have to face again. But blood once spilled does not dry clean, and the night he rode out to confront those men alone became the night his soul began to slip away, because he killed to keep a promise he never explained, and when he returned, hands shaking, eyes hollow, Clara knew without being told, her love turning into sorrow, her belief in him cracking not with anger but with quiet disappointment, which hurt far more, and Jonah confessed that he left her without goodbye, not because he stopped loving her, but because he loved her too much to let her see what he had become. And from that night on, he stopped pretending his hands were clean, he leaned into the outlaw name, wore it like armor, let fear keep people at a distance so no one would look too closely, and each robbery, each standoff, each whispered curse added another layer to the legend while burying the truth deeper. Yet even as he rode through fire and dust, there were moments when he almost turned back, moments when he saw a woman in a doorway or heard a song carried on the wind that sounded like Clara's voice, and those moments were worse than jail cells, worse than wounds, because they reminded him of the man he buried alive, and now, sitting beneath the gallows with the smell of rope and pine thick in the air, Jonah admitted that the greatest crime he ever committed was not the ones written in ink but the mercy he denied himself and the woman he left behind, because years later he learned she had waited, believing he would come back changed, believing love could outlast fear, and when he did not return, she married no one, built no life that filled the space he left, and died quietly of sickness with his name still folded in her heart, truth he learned only after it was too late to make right, and as Jonah spoke this confession into the dark, his voice broke for the first time, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a tree cracks inside long before it falls, and he admitted that every violent act after that was punishment he chose, a way to make sure the world saw him as unworthy of forgiveness, because if he could never be forgiven, then he would never have to face the weight of redemption, and the wind moved stronger now, rattling the gallows, brushing his face like cold fingers, as if urging him to finish, to leave nothing hidden, and Jonah confessed one final truth, that on the day he was captured, he could have escaped, that the door was open and the horse ready, but he stayed, because he was tired of running from a ghost that loved him once, tired of carrying a legend built on half-truths and silence, and as the moon reached its highest point, Jonah Cole lowered his head, the outlaw, the killer, the monster, and for a moment he was simply a man who had loved and failed and lived with that failure until it shaped him into something unrecognizable, and when he finally fell silent, the night did not answer, the wind softened, the gallows stood waiting, and the secret he had carried for so long settled into the earth itself, truth no one would write down, no song would ever sing, yet one that could change everything if the world had ears to hear it, because legends are loud, but confessions are quiet, and this one, spoken beneath the gallows on the eve of death, was the truest thing Jonah Cole had ever given. They said Mara Ellison arrived in Red Mesa the way a shadow arrives at dusk, quietly, without warning, and impossible to ignore once she was there, and by the time the dust settled from the wagon that carried her in, the town already knew her name and feared it, because stories traveled faster than truth in the Wild West, and hers was a name spoken low over card tables and behind saloon doors, a name tied to men who rode hard and died harder, outlaws whose lives ended in gunfire, rope, or shallow graves beneath desert stars, and no one could say for certain whether Mara brought death with her or simply loved men already running toward it. But what everyone agreed on was that she was a widow more than once, a woman wrapped in quiet grief, her dark clothes faded by sun and sorrow, her eyes holding the kind of stillness that came from having seen too much leave too soon. And she bought the small house at the edge of town where the desert pressed close, its red earth stretching endlessly, as if the land itself wished to swallow her solitude, and Mara lived simply, growing herbs, fixing her own fence, speaking politely but little, because grief had taught her that words could invite attachment, and attachment could invite loss, yet despite her distance, men watched her with a mix of longing and fear. Because she moved with a calm grace that suggested depth, and when she passed, the air felt heavier, as if something important had just gone by, and it was said that if she looked at a man too long, fate took notice, though Mara herself did not believe in curses, only patterns, and patterns had taught her that loving men who lived by the gun meant loving endings as well, and so she had promised herself, standing alone at too many graves, that she would never again let her heart settle where it could be torn away, not again, not ever, but fate has a way of stepping over promises like they were lines drawn in sand. And it was one evening when the sun burned low and cruel, painting the land in copper and gold, that she heard a sound outside her door, a heavy, uneven thud, followed by silence, and when she opened the door, there he lay, Eli Turner, though she did not know his name yet, a gunslinger worn thin by the road, blood darkening his shirt, his breath shallow but stubborn, clinging to life as if unwilling to surrender just yet, and Mara stood frozen for a moment, the past rushing at her. With all its ghosts, every man she had knelt beside, every last breath she had held, and she could have closed the door, could have turned away and let the desert finish what it had started, but something in his face stopped her, not his pain, not even his strength, but the look of surprise, as if he had not expected kindness at the end of his road, and with a quiet sigh that sounded like resignation to fate itself, Mara pulled him inside, cleaned his wounds with steady hands that remembered too well what to do, and as the night deepened, she sat beside him listening to his breathing, every rise and fall stirring memories she wished would stay buried, and when he finally woke, confusion clouded his eyes before settling on her face, and in that moment, something fragile passed between them, not love, not yet, but recognition, the sense that both had lived long enough to know how easily things break, and Eli spoke little in those first days, pain keeping him quiet, but when he did speak, his voice was gentle for a man with a gunman's hands, and he thanked her not with grand words but with small courtesies, never demanding more than she gave, and Mara found herself watching him when she thought he slept, noting the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the way his jaw tightened when distant gunfire echoed from town, signs of a man tired of violence but unable to fully escape it, and as days turned into weeks beneath the relentless sun, Eli healed slowly, helping where he could, fixing broken steps, carrying water, never asking questions about her past, and Mara, despite herself, felt the walls around her heart soften, not fall, but bend, because he did not look at her like a prize or a mystery to be solved, but like a harbor one approached carefully, grateful simply to have arrived, and at night they sat on the porch, the desert cooling at last, the sky wide and endless above them, speaking of small things, the weather, the land, the strange comfort of silence. And sometimes Eli would hum an old tune under his breath, one that stirred something in Mara she could not name, a longing mixed with fear, because she knew too well how these stories ended, yet still she stayed, still she listened, and Red Mesa noticed, as towns always do, whispers growing sharper, warnings passed like folded notes, men telling Eli what kind of woman he was staying with, how death followed her like a faithful dog, and Eli listened, nodding, but when he returned to the small house at the edge of town, he did not look at Mara with suspicion, only with concern, asking gently if the stories hurt her, and she answered honestly that they no longer surprised her, that she had buried enough men to understand why people feared patterns more than people, and one evening, as the heat lingered even after sunset, Mara finally spoke of her past, not naming every loss, but enough to make the truth clear. And Eli listened without interrupting, his eyes dark but kind, and when she finished, expecting distance, he simply said that he had never believed death followed love, only that love often followed dangerous men, and his words settled deep, because they did not argue with her pain, they stood beside it, and in the quiet days that followed, something unmistakable grew between them, not passion, not reckless hope, but a careful tenderness, the kind that knows the cost and moves forward anyway. A shared glance held a second longer, a brush of hands passed off as accident. Moments filled with meaning neither dared to name, until the past, as it always does, came riding in on dust and gunfire, men looking for Eli, men who knew his name and the trail he left behind, men who brought danger to Mara's door simply by speaking it aloud, and when Eli realized what he had done, what he had brought to her doorstep, guilt settled heavy in his chest, because he saw now how the town watched her, how the whispers sharpened, how fear returned to her eyes, and one night, beneath a sky stripped bare of clouds, Eli told her he would leave, that he would not add his name to her list of losses, that loving her meant protecting her even from himself, and Mara listened, her heart aching in a way she had sworn she would never feel again, because she knew he was right, because love in the Wild West was often a countdown rather than a promise, and yet when she pleaded quietly for him to stay, her voice trembling with all the courage she had left, Eli saw the truth he had tried to ignore, that staying would endanger her, but leaving would break something neither of them could easily mend, and dawn came too soon, the sun rising merciless and bright, and Eli saddled his horse while Mara stood on the porch, her hands clenched at her sides, refusing to beg, refusing to chain him with her grief, and when he looked back at her one last time, the desert seemed to hold its breath, because in that look lived everything they had not said, everything they could never promise, and as he rode away, dust rising behind him, Mara felt the familiar ache settle in her chest, the quiet understanding that loving men like Eli meant loving endings as well, and the town of Red Mesa would add his name to its stories, another outlaw connected to the widow who lived at the edge of the desert, but none of them would know the truth, that for a brief, fragile time, beneath the burning western sun, two broken souls had chosen tenderness over fear, even knowing it could not last, and as Mara closed her door and returned to her quiet life, the wind carried his name across the red earth, not as a curse, but as a memory, and fate, satisfied for the moment, waited patiently, because in the Wild West, love rarely ended cleanly, and this story, like the land itself, was far from finished. Deadwood Crossing lay baked and forgotten beneath a sun that showed no mercy, a town worn thin by years without law, where buildings leaned like tired men and silence carried more weight than gunfire, and when Thomas Hale rode in from the eastern trail, dust-covered and slow, no one rushed to greet him, because hope had left this place a long time ago, yet there was something about the way he sat his horse, straight back despite the limp, eyes steady despite the lines carved by regret, that made the few souls watching from porches pause their quiet despair, and when they noticed the tarnished badge pinned beneath his coat, a relic dulled by time and guilt, murmurs stirred like dry leaves, because Deadwood Crossing had buried its last marshal years ago, buried him not in the ground but in memory, after law failed and men died, and Thomas felt those whispers before he heard them, felt the town's suspicion press against his skin as he dismounted near the old jailhouse, its door hanging crooked, its cells empty except for ghosts, and he stood there for a long moment, boots planted in dust that had drunk too much blood, knowing he could still turn back, knowing he should, because he had sworn never to wear the badge again after Ridgeway, after the night his choices cost lives he was meant to protect, after he learned that good intentions did not stop bullets, but the road had brought him here all the same, as if fate itself refused to let him rest, and when the mayor, a nervous man with shaking hands, finally approached and asked why he had come, Thomas answered simply that he was passing through, though both of them knew it was a lie, because men like Thomas Hale did not wander into places like Deadwood Crossing by accident, not with a badge hidden close to the heart, and as the day wore on, the town revealed itself in pieces, a saloon ruled by fear instead of laughter, shops paying quiet tribute to men who took without asking, families who kept their heads down and their doors barred even at noon, and Thomas saw echoes of Ridgeway everywhere, the same slow rot, the same waiting for someone else to act, and that night, sitting alone in the jailhouse with the wind moaning through broken boards, Thomas finally allowed himself to remember the past. He kept buried, the ambush that went wrong, the deputies who trusted him, the moment hesitation cost them their lives, and the look in the eyes of a woman who had loved him before that night took everything, because after Ridgeway, Thomas did not just lose his badge, he lost his belief that he deserved to wear it, and that belief had guided every step since, keeping him moving, never staying long enough to fail again, until Deadwood Crossing, where failure had already taken root so deeply that even a broken man looked like a miracle, and the war everyone feared was not rumor but fact, because Silas Crow, a name spoken like a curse, had claimed the town as his own, a man who thrived where law disappeared, whose men patrolled openly, whose rules were enforced with fists and bullets, and when Thomas refused Crow's polite invitation to leave town by sunrise, the message was clear: Deadwood Crossing would not share space with a marshal, broken or not, and fear spread fast, people begging Thomas to go, to save himself if nothing else, because they had learned that standing up only made things worse. But Thomas listened with the same steady calm he brought to everything now, not promising salvation, not stirring false courage, only saying that running had not saved Ridgway, and he would not let it save him now. And as word spread that the marshal intended to stay, something fragile shifted in the town, not hope exactly, but possibility, because seeing someone choose to stand reminded people that standing was still an option, and Thomas began quietly preparing, fixing the jailhouse door, mapping the streets, learning who might help and who could not, never asking more than he could carry himself, because he would not ask others to die for his mistakes again. And when Crow's men tested the town, pushing harder, breaking windows, making examples, Thomas stepped in with firm words and quicker hands, not eager for violence but unafraid of it, and people noticed that he did not shoot unless he had to, that he spoke to men as if they were still men, even when they did not deserve it, and that restraint, born of regret, became his greatest weapon. Yet the ghosts did not stay quiet, because every night Thomas dreamed of Ridgway, of shouting over gunfire, of a moment too late, and each morning he woke knowing Deadwood Crossing was moving toward the same edge, and the night before the expected attack, when Crow planned to take the town by force and prove once and for all that law was a memory, Thomas stood alone in the street beneath lantern light, badge finally visible, coat open to the world, and the townspeople gathered at a distance, watching the man who had chosen them despite himself. And in that moment, Thomas did not feel heroic, did not feel redeemed, he felt afraid, because courage, he had learned, was not the absence of fear but the decision to act while carrying it. And when Silas Crow rode in at dawn with his men, guns ready, Deadwood Crossing held its breath, and Thomas stepped forward to meet them, speaking calmly, naming Crow's crimes, offering him a chance to leave without bloodshed, knowing full well it would be refused, but needing to say it anyway, because law, at its core, was still about choice. And when the shooting started, it was chaos, dust and sound and shattered wood, but Thomas moved with purpose, covering streets, guiding townsfolk to safety, taking hits that slowed him but did not stop him, because stopping meant repeating Ridgway, and he would not do that again. And as the fight wore on, something remarkable happened. The townspeople joined in, not recklessly, not as heroes, but as neighbors protecting what little they had left, and Thomas saw in their faces the proof that his presence had mattered, that standing had spread. And when Silas Crow finally fell, not to Thomas's bullet but to the combined will of a town that had found its spine, the silence that followed felt different from the silence before, heavier, but cleaner, and Thomas stood in the street long after the dust settled. Wounds aching, heart heavier still, because victory did not erase the past, but it did reshape the present. And when the mayor offered him the marshal's post officially, the badge polished and new, Thomas looked down at the old one he carried, the one worn smooth by regret, and said he would stay for a while, not forever, because redemption was not a destination, it was a direction. And Deadwood Crossing, battered but breathing, watched the broken marshal walk back into the jailhouse, not as a savior, not as a legend, but as a man who had finally learned that wearing the badge was not about never failing, but about choosing to stand again after you do. And as night fell, the wind moved gently through the town, no longer whispering only of fear, and the ghosts of Ridgway, though still present, seemed quieter somehow, as if even they understood that while the past could never be undone, the future was still being written, one hard choice at a time. Black Canyon cut through the earth like an old wound that never healed, its shadows deep even at midday, and men who rode past it lowered their voices without knowing why, because long before maps were drawn and borders argued over, the land there had earned a name that carried weight, a place whispered about in saloons and mining camps as cursed, watched, and unwilling to give without taking something far greater in return. And it was into this uneasy silence that Samuel Price wandered, a prospector worn thin by years of near misses and empty pans, a man whose hands shook not from greed but from exhaustion, because hope, when starved too long, begins to ache like hunger, and Samuel had lost everything except his stubborn belief that one good find could set his life right, that one strike of luck could quiet the regret that followed him like a second shadow, and he found the map by accident, tucked inside the false bottom of a desk he bought cheap from a dying miner, a brittle piece of paper marked with symbols too careful to be madness and lines too deliberate to be lies, leading straight into Black Canyon, and though every warning he had ever heard rose up in his mind, Samuel felt something else rise with it, something colder and more certain, as if the canyon itself had reached out and placed the map in his hands, and from the moment he unfolded it, the whispers began, faint at first, like wind brushing stone, telling him things he did not want to hear but could not forget, promising an end to hunger, an end to wandering, an end to being small. And Samuel told himself it was imagination, that men chasing gold always heard voices of one kind or another, yet as he packed his mule and turned west, the air seemed to thicken around him, the desert stretching longer than it ever had before, and at night, when the fire burned low, he dreamed not of gold but of choices, doors opening one by one, each demanding a price he did not yet understand. And the closer he came to Black Canyon, the stronger the presence became, not loud, not violent, but patient, as if it had waited a very long time for someone like him. And when he finally stood at the canyon's edge, staring down into darkness carved by time and something older, the whispers spoke clearly for the first time, calling his name in a voice that sounded almost like his own, telling him he was chosen not because he was strong, but because he was desperate. And Samuel descended anyway, each step echoing like a promise and a warning all at once, following the map through narrow passes and hidden ledges until he found the vein. Glowing faintly even without light, gold threaded through black stone like fire trapped beneath the earth, and the sight stole his breath, because it was more than wealth, it was proof that his suffering had meaning, that all the empty years had led here. And as he reached out to touch it, the canyon fell silent, the whispers pausing as if waiting for him to speak first, and Samuel laughed then, a broken sound filled with relief and disbelief, promising aloud that he would take only what he needed, that he would leave the rest untouched, that he would not become one of those men whose souls were swallowed by greed. And the canyon seemed to listen, the stone humming softly beneath his palm, and for a brief moment, Samuel believed he had outwitted the curse, that intention alone could bend fate, and he filled his pack with gold, careful not to take too much, telling himself moderation was protection. But as he climbed back toward the light, the whispers returned, warmer now, approving, praising his restraint while quietly urging him to consider what a little more could change, how one extra handful could buy comfort, how two could buy security, how three could buy peace. And Samuel argued with the voices as one argues with temptation, insisting he was done, yet his feet slowed, his hands trembled, and before he realized it, he had turned back, just once, just for a moment, because the canyon promised it would understand, and with each return, the line between his thoughts and the whispers blurred, until he no longer knew which desires were his and which were planted, and time lost its shape, days passing without meaning as Samuel carried gold up and down the canyon, never satisfied, never full, the weight on his mule growing heavier while his own chest felt strangely hollow. And when he finally left Black Canyon for good, the desert felt wrong, stretched thin and watchful, the whispers following him not as sound but as memory, and townspeople noticed the change at once, the way his eyes darted, the way he flinched at quiet, the way he guarded his pack as if it might speak if left alone. And Samuel tried to spend the gold, to turn it into something solid and real, but every coin felt cold, heavy with expectation, and each purchase left him more uneasy than before, because the voices did not stop. They reminded him that the gold was not meant to be shared, that it was bound to him, that giving it away weakened the bargain he had never agreed to but had nonetheless accepted. And at night, he dreamed of Black Canyon opening wider, of shadows shifting into shapes that wore familiar faces, men who had once believed as he did, all promising that it would end if he just returned, just once more. And Samuel resisted longer than most, driven not by virtue but by fear, because deep down he understood that the price was not death, not madness, but devotion, a slow surrender of choice itself. And when the whispers began to speak of other people, of how easily the gold could protect him, how sacrifice was simply another form of payment, Samuel packed his mule again, not chasing riches this time but running from them. Yet the desert has a way of leading men back to where they are weakest, and Black Canyon appeared on the horizon once more, its shadows welcoming, patient as ever, and Samuel collapsed at its edge, weeping not from fear but from clarity, because he finally understood that the devil's gold was not cursed because it killed, but because it convinced men they were still choosing while it quietly chose for them, and in that moment of terrible honesty, Samuel did the only thing left to him, the thing the whispers had never suggested. He emptied his pack, scattering the gold back into the canyon, each piece hitting stone with a sound like finality, and the voices rose in anger and disbelief, promising punishment, promising regret, but Samuel felt lighter with every coin he released, the weight lifting not just from his shoulders but from his mind. And when the last piece was gone, the canyon grew still, not pleased, not defeated, but indifferent, as ancient things often are, and Samuel climbed away with nothing but his life and the quiet knowledge that some treasures exist only to test whether a man knows when to walk away. And long after he vanished into the desert, Black Canyon remained, waiting, because maps can be burned and stories forgotten, but desperation is never scarce, and the devil's gold, patient and whispering, would always find another listener.